From Blade Runner to Terminator, the rise of machines and machine learning is no longer the future of leisure and entertainment, but one of nightmares. Our guest, Michael Harris, has a new book out that tells us how science fiction isn't simply predicting the future, but using the idea of the future to warn us about our now. Please welcome. He's a doctor, honey. Dr. Michael Harris.
Hi, Jason. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very well.
Excited about this. I've been trying to get this for a while. We're going back and forth with dates. I do want to remind people the first ever live stream guest was Dr. Michael Harris. So TIR vet, you could say this gentleman is, and it's always an honor to have you on the show. We talked about this book because through this show we've become friends, and you sent me this manuscript 2 years ago.
Yeah.
2 years ago you sent this to me, and when I read it 2 years ago, I was fired up. It was one of those things I read where you feel like a beautiful mind. You can see all the numbers now, and like everything's certain movies I can't see anymore. Can't watch Back to the Future the same way. Every time I bring up part of the conversation that you have in your book about Back to the Future 1 and 2, it's like you see everybody starts seeing everything, right? Why do you think the early Cold War space race visions of the future weren't so laden with man's corporate control of the planet and its resources, but more with the hope of a technologically advanced civilization? At worst, we saw nuclear-powered monsters that were an accident, or evil aliens, but that was about it. What leads us to Soylent Green and silent running of the early 70s, in your opinion?
Yeah. So that's the question, isn't it? I think what happens is 1950s sci-fi is about a fear of too much progress or progress getting out of control.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the kind of nuclear accidents or robots and so on. So it's about a kind of future shock, things moving too fast. We invent these incredible technologies and then they slip out of our grasp. And then you get to the 1970s and it's about a lack of progress or where that progress might have taken us, and a kind of stasis. And that's why I start the book in Blade Runner, because it's really unusual. If you think about it, sci-fi dates so quickly, and becomes kind of a bit embarrassing so quickly because things move on. But Blade Runner hasn't in that way. It's still our vision of the future, and there's still cyberpunk movies and TV shows and anime and video games and so on, and you can look at them and say, oh yeah, that's essentially Blade Runner. And so I start with Blade Runner because it signifies the kind of end of the future.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Blade Runner was trying to be predictive, in the sense of warning us this is where we could end up. I think it was trying to be descriptive, saying that is the future. And because politically that future hasn't changed in terms of corporate domination, environmental collapse, inequality, and so on, then in that sense, there's been no need to update that vision of the future. and a vision of the future that's 40 years old is still relevant. And that's really odd in one sense if you think about sci-fi, because if you went back 40 years from Blade Runner, those visions of the future are kind of ridiculous. They don't relate
The
to our world.
Japanese ruling everything. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah, and the kind of shiny robots and so on. We don't relate to And people in the early 1980s wouldn't have related to that kind of post-war sci-fi vision of the future. But Blade Runner, we still can absolutely relate to. And we'll talk about it more, but it's that change in the 1970s because of what was happening in politics and the environmental movement and so on, which I think fundamentally changed and was reflected in science fiction.
I mean, the environmental movement, which begins really powerful in the late 60s, early 70s, kind of gives us the Silent Running, that science fiction movie with Bruce Dern. I think it comes out in 1970, 71. I can't remember the exact year, but I know it's
Mhm.
the early 70s. Um, and also to your point about shiny robots, it's funny that for some reason shiny robots go the way of the dodo. Why do shiny robots become an imagined past, in your opinion?
Because this is one of the things I talk about in relation to Back to the Future, which sounds like an odd choice for a book about kind of dystopian sci-fi, because many people would think of it as a kind of entertaining but light sci-fi comedy that's quite Reaganite.
Mhm,
We
mhm.
can get into why people think that, and I understand that. But the way I talk about that film in the book is it's really about the decline of that 1950s, early 1960s space race, as you say, excitement about the technological and social possibilities of the future, and it's really about disinvestment and decline. And
Mhm.
you see it around the edges a bit in the first movie, and then it comes out more strongly in the kind of more sci-fi, more dystopian second movie. But it's not a Morning in America Reaganite
No.
theories to me. When you look at it more closely, it's about that disinvestment in the public sphere, and it's about the the that middle class American dream fading or having gone, and it's about living under that kind of grinding feeling of failure in American culture and society, and nothing they do, nothing that family does, can really escape the legacy of that right wing disinvestment, that conservative disinvestment in the public sphere. This is not a happy small town.
No.
Even at the start of the first film, there's if you look in the background, there's an adult bookstore. There's the local cinema is showing porn films. There's tattoo parlors. The clock tower hasn't been repaired.
In 50 or 30 years, I guess that would be.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So until I read your book, I never put two and two together of the dilapidated Hill Valley, which is the town that Marty McFly lives in. Um, because to me, it looks like he's got kind of an idyllic life compared to the urban blight of where I grew up in a city called Richmond, California. That being said, um, rewatching it after reading your book, you see a whole different movie, and it also sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole. This was a while back. I think we did that show a year or so ago, of watching interviews with the writers of the script
Mhm.
or the directors. I can't remember, but they were talking about that was their message in the movie was, to your point, to talk about the loss of middle class security, which becomes paramount in a post World War II America. It is middle class security that will defeat communism at home in the eyes of people like Joseph McCarthy. But movies like Back to the Future Part 2, where they go literally to the future, right? Because so much of the first one is spent in 1955 in this imagined great era where no one seems to have a bad word to say about the one black guy in town. Uh, um, Many people look at Back to the Future 2 as a future that didn't happen. Cards and skateboards aren't flying. We don't have vehicles powered by banana peels. I mean, there's biodiesel, but it's not like this wondrous thing that the doctor does where he puts the garbage in the car and it takes off in the air. One thing that they seemed to get right was our love for charismatic figures, because there's the Biff kind of Trump figure that you get in part 2, and the world is deduced to kind of violence and porn, or gambling and porn, sorry. And I find that fascinating as sports betting is becoming ridiculously popular with people that were in the non-sports crowd, and a lot of that stems from like fantasy football and then gambling on things like the NCAA tournament. And I'm only speaking in the US context. The UK kind of has their own history of gambling as well. We won't get into that's a whole other show um, to get into that. But we are in a moment now where gambling is everywhere. I mean, when I was growing up, you would never have a professional sports franchise in Las Vegas, just for the simple fact that Las Vegas is a city that's the state of Nevada, literally built around gaming. And to have now multiple professional franchises in Las Vegas and doing somewhat well. And I think even professional players now can have like fantasy teams, which is a form of gambling, and a form of gambling that I'm not the biggest fan of, because you're putting value on people in a way that I think is kind of foul. We don't have to get into that. But it seems like they do get that part right in Back to the Future. But again, to your point, they're not really predicting the future, but they're telling us more about where they think we are. And this movie came out around the same time as the first one, or at least they made it around the same time as the first one, like 86, 87.
Yeah, late 80s. The two sequels, I think. So the first one was 85, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, sounds about
It's
right.
Yeah. So another reason I think it's not a Reaganite film is the 1955 they go back to, which of course is what the Reaganites and the Thatcherites in the UK idealized and wanted to go back to. Actually, you go back to that era and it's revealed quite lightly, because it's still a comedy, but it's revealed as racist, sexist, violent,
Mm-hmm.
and not the era we actually want to go back to at all. So there's this kind of slight satire of that. People think it's Reaganite because at the end of the first film, of course, um, the the family has become yuppified. The father becomes the successful sci-fi author. But then you kind of look at it. Well, so Pauline Kael, for example, the famous film reviewer for the film critic for the New Yorker, said, this is a yuppie fantasy, and it should be satire, but it isn't. But I look at it and think that's absolutely satire of that Reaganite yuppified aspirational dream that they were selling. And you think of it, which family would you rather hang around with? The family at the start of the movie, albeit they're dysfunctional, but they're kind of fun and interesting and sparky and weird, or the yuppified family at the end of the movie. It's definitely the family at the start of the movie you'd rather have dinner with. And then we get to the 2015, which at that point was, of course, in the future. And one version, the Hell Valley version of that, was explicitly based on Donald Trump. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they absolutely modeled the future kind of Biff Tannen on Donald Trump, and there's a huge casino at the center of the town and a museum to Tannen's achievements, and he's taken over all the countries. So it's explicitly, it is American carnage before Trump started talking about it. And then the betting is interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things I think the film is also about is the myth of meritocracy. And this idea, because you might think the film is about, you can make your own future, and they kind of say that, but then actually what happens in the film plays against that in reality. And betting is very well chosen for that, because when people no longer believe in that myth of meritocracy, then you may as well gamble, right? You're not going to get ahead by the idea of kind of slow, steady work and investing in yourself and hoping you have a great career. You may as well gamble, and again, that's really well depicted in the movie about how gambling takes over this town. So